The weight of color. Dr. Alara Voss had always suspected that colors carried more authority than language, though she had dedicated her life to studying both. As a cultural semiotician based in Vienna, she specialized in chromatic symbolism across civilizations, examining how societies assigned meaning to shades that, in purely physical terms, were nothing more than refracted light. Yet she knew that no human being encountered color as a neutral phenomenon. It arrived already saturated with memory, ideology, and desire. Her fascination began in childhood when she noticed that her grandmother refused to wear black except at funerals, insisting that the color absorbed not only light but optimism. To Alara, this seemed implausible, yet she could not deny the palpable shift in atmosphere when her grandmother's wardrobe turned from amber and sage to charcoal and obsidian during periods of mourning. The house itself appeared dimmer, as though grief had a palette of its own. Years later, during her doctoral research, Alara explored the political appropriation of color in revolutionary movements. Crimson banners, indigo sashes, saffron robes, each hue functioned as both aesthetic choice and ideological declaration. She argued that color operated as a silent rhetoric, shaping collective emotion before a single slogan was articulated. Her dissertation proposed that chromatic allegiance often preceded verbal persuasion, a thesis that was initially met with skepticism but later praised for its interdisciplinary precision. Despite her academic rigor, Alara's relationship with color was never entirely analytical. She found herself unusually sensitive to tonal variation. The difference between cobalt and ultramarine felt as significant to her as a shift in dialect. She could detect melancholy in washed-out pastels and authority in saturated navy. This sensitivity was not synesthetic in a clinical sense, yet it bordered on the intuitive, as though color communicated in frequencies just beneath conscious thought. When she accepted a visiting professorship in Kyoto, Alara encountered a chromatic philosophy distinct from the European frameworks she knew so well. There, she studied the historical reverence for subtlety in color gradation, particularly in textiles and seasonal aesthetics. The understated elegance of muted plum or weathered silver challenged her previous emphasis on bold symbolic contrasts. She began to appreciate how restraint could convey depth more effectively than vibrancy. Her lectures gradually evolved from categorical analysis to phenomenological inquiry. Instead of asking what red meant in different societies, she asked how it was experienced. Was it perceived as urgency, danger, vitality, or devotion? Students responded with narratives rather than definitions, recounting childhood bedrooms painted in pale turquoise or uniforms dyed in institutional gray. These accounts reinforced Alara's conviction that color resided as much in biography as in culture. Outside the university, Alara spent hours walking through markets, observing how vendors arranged produce not merely by type but by chromatic harmony. Pyramids of citrus flared beside heaps of emerald herbs, while deep violet eggplants absorbed afternoon light with quiet dignity. She realized that even commercial spaces relied on intuitive color theory, guiding perception and appetite through deliberate juxtaposition. A pivotal moment occurred during an exhibition curated by a contemporary installation artist who worked exclusively in white. Visitors entered a vast room layered in gradations from alabaster to ivory to frost. At first glance, the space appeared monochromatic, yet prolonged attention revealed astonishing complexity. Alara felt her analytical frameworks dissolve as she confronted the inadequacy of language to distinguish between shades that evoked serenity, sterility, or transcendence depending on their texture and illumination. This encounter compelled her to reconsider the hierarchy she had unconsciously imposed on color. She had privileged intensity over subtlety, contrast over continuity. The exhibition suggested that meaning did not require saturation, it could emerge from nuance. In response, Elara began drafting a book that questioned the binary opposition between vivid and muted palettes, proposing instead that chromatic perception functioned along an emotional spectrum rather than a visual one. As her manuscript progressed, she reflected on the ethical implications of color symbolism. Throughout history, hues had been weaponized to demarcate belonging and exclusion. Certain pigments signified purity, others deviance, some conferred status, while others enforced invisibility. Elara examined how these associations lingered in contemporary discourse, shaping judgments that appeared instinctive but were, in fact, culturally conditioned. Her research extended into environmental psychology, where she collaborated with architects designing hospitals and educational spaces. They debated whether cool blues genuinely calmed patients or whether such effects depended on prior associations. Elara insisted that context-mediated response, a shade that soothed in one environment could alienate in another. The neutrality often attributed to minimalist palettes, she argued, was itself an aesthetic ideology. In quieter moments, she contemplated her own chromatic preferences. She noticed her gradual gravitation toward deep forest green, a color she associated with introspection and continuity. Unlike the assertiveness of scarlet or the austerity of black, green seemed to negotiate between vitality and restraint. It neither demanded attention nor retreated into invisibility. Perhaps, she mused, her affinity reflected an aspiration toward equilibrium. As public interest in design and branding intensified, Elara was invited to consult for organizations seeking chromatic identities. She approached these projects cautiously, wary of reducing complex human enterprises to a single shade. Still, she acknowledged that color could encapsulate intention with startling efficiency. A carefully chosen tone communicated ethos before mission statements were read. In the final chapter of her book, Elara wrote that color was not an attribute of objects but a relationship between light, perception, and interpretation. It was inherently unstable, shifting with context and consciousness. To claim that blue unequivocally signified tranquility or that yellow invariably expressed joy was to ignore the intricate interplay between experience and environment. Color resisted absolutism. When the book was published, critics described it as both scholarly and meditative. Some readers expected definitive conclusions but instead encountered layered reflections that invited contemplation. Elara considered this response appropriate. After decades of study, she had not sought to codify color into rigid doctrine but to illuminate its fluidity. Standing one evening by the Danube, watching the sky dissolve from apricot to mauve to a blue so dark it bordered on indigo, Elara felt a quiet confirmation of her life's work. The river mirrored each transition without possessing any color of its own. It merely reflected what light allowed. In that moment, she understood that color, like identity, was neither fixed nor illusory. It was relational, contingent, and perpetually in motion. And so she continued her inquiries, attentive to every subtle shift in hue that passed across walls, landscapes, and faces, aware that within each gradation lay histories, emotions, and silent narratives waiting to be perceived.